Bonjour à tous. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to welcome Professor Arno to Tohoku region as a member of Tohoku University. I would like also to thank Cécile very heartily and Olivier for giving me the opportunity to be here today and also to have joined more recently MITATE Lab as one of the members of Tohoku University. My name is Sébastien Boret. I'm going to switch. I'm originally from France, but I studied mainly in the UK, where I did my PhD, my studies in anthropology, including my PhD, until 2011. Just a few days before I actually defended my thesis, the 2011 Great East Japan Earthquake struck the coastal region of Japan. And it was very meaningful and sorrowful for me because I was actually doing my fieldwork as a PhD student in Tohoku, especially in Sendai and also Ichinoseki in Iwate Prefecture. So in 2012, I managed to get a GSPS postdoctoral fellowship to come back to Tohoku and start my research on disaster. So as you can see, my field of originally my field of research is more to do with death. Funerals, grief, and then it expanded as I worked on the disaster to collective memory and more recently disability. And I've been working since 2006 in Japan, 2014 in Indonesia, and 2015 in France. So I'll be looking first at the politics of memorization. Just for those who are familiar, because today is an interdisciplinary workshop, so I thought I'll say a few words about perspective of what is collective memory. So first of all, collective memory is not a metaphor, but a social reality transmitted and sustained through the conscious effort of the group. This is very important because that means that when you see an aspect of collective memory, whether it's a memorial monument, a museum or something, we have to understand that it's been part of a decision process. It's not something that is just coming naturally into our culture, even though it is sometimes feels like this. Collective memory is sustained by places of memory. And these are objects, places, concrete or ideal, or events that were not forgotten because they are holders of collective memory. What do I mean by that? I'm going to take a field site which is a little bit further from Tohoku, which is Indonesia. So in 2004, the tsunami struck 14 countries in Southeast and East and South Asia, including Indonesia and the areas of Aceh. And when you go to Aceh today, you will find several places of memory. It can be an area. So if you go to Ulele, for example, that would be an idea. There might be remains. And this is meaningful because, of course, we find similar things in Japan. It might be people, it might be symbols, like a clock, a device, a blessing in disguise, which is actually a religious saying. It might be an institution, like the museum here, or it might be a date. And you can see, for those who are familiar with Japan, straight away you can replace those. I took those for you to remember the concept first, rather than the places. But if you think about an area, you think Tohoku, Fukushima. If you think about remains, you can think about the Minami Sanriku Bosai Tatemono. You can think about probably symbols, clocks, of course, 311, the time of when the tsunami struck in Japan. Institution, there's many denshokans, including in Fukushima. And the date, of course, if I say 311 Sansen Juichinichi in Japan, everybody knows what I'm talking about. So what about memorial monuments, which probably are the most kind of like familiar places? And that's what I've been researching since 2012. I've been looking at what we call irehi. Irehi are memorials for the Great East Japan earthquake victims. For example, this one is in Miyako City. And irehi have the particularity of being graves without bodies. And in English, we call it cenotaph. We find that a lot of that for World War II in Europe, for example. I've been looking at kinenki. Our kinenki are more dedicated to the disaster per se. So therefore, it's much more about what happened on that day, the tsunami and the destruction, the whole event, not so much the victims. And I started to make a map. I'm not the only one, but we're starting to make a map of all these memorials which are located on the coastline of Tohoku River, sorry. And then, of course, I'll be looking at what's the roles of these memorial monuments. Because I talk about collective memory, that's an obvious one to remember. But they do much more than that, much more than that. And one of the processes that I need to talk about, which I didn't put on this slide, is actually the construction of the monument itself. But let's first go like, once the monument is built, what do? So this is, these three monuments are located in Miyagi-ken, Natori City, Yuriage. And these, you have three, I put three types of monuments in the, one is the junior high school, so where 14 children lost their lives in Yuriage. And this monument is part of a psychological healing, kokoro no care or grief care. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is social reconstruction. Actually, these monuments are also, when you have a destruction, so it's a tsunami of 2011, you enter areas where there's actually nothing on the ground. It's just a lunar landscape. So when you have a memorial monument such as this Jizo, for example, who's standing in the middle of the ground, this is where every visitors go. This is where survivors go. This is where official goes. We had and so forth. So this is a way of maintaining the community or at the time when nothing is there. And as we know, or as some of us know, from 2011 to almost 2017 in some areas, including Yuriage, there was absolutely nothing in the devastated area. And then disaster education, and then looking forward. How do we maintain, it's not just maintaining the memory, oh, in 2011 there was a tsunami, but we want to know, okay, what was the lessons learned at that time? What do we know about the tsunami that we need to remember? And this is what is performed often at disaster monuments. So schools, for example, visit regularly these monuments and so forth. So as a kid, I went to World War II memorial monuments in France to actually remember the war and the atrocity of the war. And in Japan, nowadays, a lot of school pupils go to memorial monuments to learn about what happened in 2011. And, obviously to save lives and also to understand the lives of survivors. It's not just to save yourself, it's also understand others who are living with these traumas now. So other places includes, temporary places where people just, put flowers spontaneously in areas which are inhabited originally. These were full of houses originally. In Nobiru, this is Higashima Tsushima. There are cemeteries as well. Cemeteries were existing places, but they're also places where people rebuilt their communities. And this man actually was in his 70s at the time with his son-in-law are carrying this very heavy stone, which was their family grave. Of course, there are ceremonies. This is the self-defense force ceremonies in Higashima Tsushima, where there were thousands of people. That was normally a place where you put airplanes, so you have a lot of space. And that's where, they held the ceremony. That was the first ceremony in 2012, celebrating the 1-year anniversary. So, and this is, the place I mentioned earlier, which is in Yuriage. So this is in junior high school where, again, parents and then also survivors come to remember the 14 children and other victims, obviously. So I don't think I have the photograph, but they're actually looking at balloons, Fusen, actually flying into the sky. And this is very popular among the media as well. This is one of the most mediated ceremony in Tohoku. So what we learn is that disaster memorization in general may contribute, of course, to memory and culture preservation from generation to generation, because disasters are part of our culture. And this is what the benefit of studying, for me, disaster in Japan is that I find that disasters, including Fukushima, is going to remain part of Japanese culture. This is how we're going to build the society of the future, is by looking at what happened during Fukushima. So we need to pay attention to what people do in these places, not only these places themselves. And often there has been a lot of research to do with how does a monument is built, what is its symbols, what does it mean? But what people do, not only in the short term, but in the long term, is also very important. May I ask how many minutes I have left? 4 minutes. So I'm just going to gallop through the last few slides. So what else do I look at? I look at crisis management, an extension of my work, which is on looking at mass deaths. So mass deaths, again, my interest in this topic is that it's not just linked to Japan, it's linked to France, Indonesia, and any kind of crisis management of these days. So this is a long-term, I'm not going to take through every step, but from the disaster event to these long-term memorials, which I mentioned. And that includes the management of the body of the dead, and that includes natural hazard, terrorist attacks, war, any kind of management. What are the issues that we face? And how can we reduce the impact of this mass management? So what do I mean by that? Is that when you deal with mass death, you deal with grief, you deal with ceremonies, but you deal with bodies. And the way you deal with these bodies is actually going to affect the other two parts, which I mean the bereaved and the society. So the better you deal with the bodies, with dignity, for example, the better you're going to help your bereaved and your society to overcome the experience of mass death. So, and maybe I'm going to skip this because we are not. Another aspect I'm looking at is disability and vulnerability. I've been made aware through time in living in Japan about the issue of how people with disability deal with disasters. And that includes evacuation and so forth. And one of the key information that I want to share with you today, that the mortality rate against the total population was 1.3 higher, was 1.1%, whereas that of disabled people was 2%. It's not much, but it's double. So that's something we have to consider. In Miyagi, we find even higher figure where it was 0.8 for people without disability to 3.5%. So as a member of the International Research Disaster Institute in Tokyo University, this is one of the issues that I need to deal with. I need to find out how basically we can work with a disabled population to actually protect them better during earthquake. So far, I haven't mentioned much Fukushima, have I? But all these topics, I'm going to jump to this link. All these topics are actually linked to Fukushima in many sense, because Fukushima just exacerbates, for example, the issue of dealing with bodies. When you think about even whether it's a fact, whether it's an imagine, how do you deal with radioactive dead bodies? Secondly, also still related to death, the Fukushima conditions actually exacerbated the number of suicides as well that we find. And this is what we call now extended death. So that's also a very important development, is that when you think about death in disaster, you don't think just about the people who actually passed away on the day. You think about all the people that then going to pass away because of physiological or psychological trauma that they received from the disaster. And those these need to be accounted for now. Of course, that's something that, thanks to Cécile, I became very interested in, even though, or more practically invested in, is the collective memory of radioactivity. How we're going to remember something that we don't see, and who is going to do it, and what are going to be then the politics of it. And I wanted to mention it, but I could have stayed on the memory of radioactivity, which would have been more meaningful, but the increased sense of vulnerability of disabled population in Fukushima as well, because these people rely on very long-term social networks and social institutions that have been built, especially for those. So how do these, once they are scattered and once they are fragilized, how do we reconstruct those in this kind of situation, especially when there's no return possible? That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have time for questions.
Is there a connection, or what is the connection between the notion of mass death and the number of deaths? At which point is it a mass death?
Yes. So the mass death is defined is in relation to our capacity to deal with the number of bodies we are facing. So a mass death can start with a few dozens if you have a very low capacity, to a few hundred to a few thousand. And this is actually, that's the purpose of this study, is to actually, how do we anticipate that? And this requires preparation, as we have in Blanc in France, and we have London fatality mass death and so forth. So we need to kind of, depending on scenarios, and that's the research we're hoping to do. Thank you very much for your question.